He thought the arranged marriage was a trap, until the bride lifted her veil and stunned him. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now let's dive into today's story. Have you ever felt trapped by a situation that seemed impossible to escape? Well, today's story might just remind you that life has a funny way of turning things around. So let's get started. Vincent Lee wasn't one to trust easily. At 32, he had already built a tech empire from the ground up, turning a small startup into one of the most successful companies in Silicon Valley. But despite his immense wealth and power, Vincent was no stranger to loneliness. His days were filled with back-to-back meetings, endless negotiations, and an unyielding drive to stay at the top. He didn't have time for personal relationships, especially not for something as absurd as an arranged marriage. He chuckled at the thought, but the truth was, his family had been pressuring him for months. You need someone to take over the family business, Vincent, his father had said. You can't just bury yourself in your work forever. So, when his parents brought up the idea of a marriage of convenience to strengthen the family name and secure an alliance with a rival company, Vincent reluctantly agreed. After all, what was the worst that could happen? A wedding, a contract, and a wife who would stay out of his way. That's what he thought, at least. He had no idea how wrong he was. Clara Zhang, on the other hand, had no interest in marriage, at least, not to a man like Vincent. A businesswoman in her own right, Clara was no stranger to the pressures of family legacy and expectations. But after years of working under the watchful eye of her controlling father, she'd grown tired of it all. When the marriage proposal came, Clara saw it as her chance to break free. The terms were simple. She would marry Vincent, play the role of the perfect wife for the public, and in return, her father would stop pushing her into the family business. It was a deal she couldn't refuse. At the very least, it would give her a chance to live her life on her own terms, even if it meant sacrificing her happiness for a while. The night of their wedding arrived faster than either of them anticipated. The ceremony was a small, private affair, just close family and a few business associates. Clara had never felt more out of place, her wedding dress heavy with the weight of her decision. Vincent, standing at the altar, couldn't help but notice how stunning she looked. But there was something about her eyes, something guarded. He was too distracted by his own thoughts to give it much attention. After all, this was just business. But the moment Clara lifted her veil, everything changed. The brief glance they shared across the altar felt like 1,000 unspoken words. Clara, standing there in her elegant dress, didn't look like someone playing a role. She looked like someone who had been forced into a corner, and for the first time, Vincent saw her as more than just a business transaction. He saw her as a person. It was a fleeting moment, but it left him with a strange feeling he couldn't shake. Was this just the beginning of a deal, or something much more complicated? As the reception unfolded, Vincent couldn't focus on the congratulations or the obligatory small talk. His mind kept drifting back to Clara, and he began to wonder, could a marriage born from convenience really become something more? But that was a question he didn't have the answer to, at least, not yet. For Clara, the night felt surreal. She had expected the wedding to be a formality, a duty she would perform with as little emotion as possible. But now, standing beside Vincent, she couldn't ignore the feeling that had started to creep in. Was this really just a business deal? Or was there something more to their connection than she had anticipated? The night was still young, but the tension between them was palpable. Neither of them knew what the future held, but both knew this was only the beginning of a much more complicated story. And neither was prepared for what would come next. As the days passed after the wedding, Vincent and Clara fell into an uneasy routine. Their marriage was a transaction, an arrangement designed to protect their families and their respective businesses. On the surface, everything appeared fine. Vincent continued his work in the tech world, his company growing even more successful with Clara by his side at public events. But beneath the surface, things were far from simple. Clara, who had initially agreed to the arrangement to escape her father's control, now found herself grappling with something unexpected, her feelings for Vincent. She had always seen him as a cold, calculating businessman, someone who didn't care for anyone other than himself. But since the wedding, she had seen another side to him. Someone thoughtful, someone who wasn't afraid to speak his mind, but also someone who still carried the weight of his past. On one quiet evening, as Clara sat in their luxurious penthouse overlooking the city, she found herself reflecting on the strange bond that had begun to form between them. Vincent had asked her to join him for dinner, and despite the tension between them, she couldn't deny that she was beginning to look forward to their evenings together. Dinner that night was different. As they sat across from each other at the dining table, Vincent broke the silence. "Clara," he said, his voice unusually soft, "I know this marriage wasn't what either of us wanted, but I just want you to know that I didn't force you into this. I never meant to make you feel like you had no choice." Clara looked at him, surprised by the sincerity in his words. She had always believed that he had gone along with the marriage because it benefited him, because it secured his company's future. But now, as she looked into his eyes, she saw something else. "I never thought you did," she replied, her voice softer than she intended. "But it's hard not to feel like I'm just playing a role in your life." Vincent paused, his expression unreadable. "I get that, and I'm sorry, but maybe that's just the way things are sometimes. Life doesn't always give us what we expect." Clara nodded, her mind racing. She couldn't help but wonder if Vincent felt the same pull she did, the unspoken connection that had started to grow between them. They had shared moments of laughter, of quiet understanding, but she was afraid to let herself believe that there could be more. But that night, something changed. As they finished dinner, Vincent leaned back in his chair and looked at her. "Clara, I know I've kept my distance, but I want you to know that I appreciate you. Not just for this marriage, but for who you are." Clara's heart skipped a beat. She had never heard him speak like this before, and for the first time, she realized that maybe, just maybe, this marriage could become something more than just a business deal. The next few weeks were filled with awkward but sincere moments as they navigated their new life together. Vincent continued to throw himself into work, but there were moments when he would glance over at Clara, a look of quiet admiration in his eyes. And Clara, despite her initial reservations, began to see Vincent in a new light. He wasn't just the cold, distant CEO she had imagined. He was someone who had built his empire from nothing, someone who had sacrificed much to get where he was. And yet, here he was, giving her the respect and attention she had never expected. One day, as they walked through the city together after an event, Clara felt a light touch on her hand. She glanced over at Vincent, who was walking beside her with a thoughtful look on his face. "What is it?" she asked, her heart racing slightly. Vincent didn't answer immediately, but instead, he smiled. Just a small, fleeting smile that made her heart flutter. "I'm just thinking about how much things have changed," he said quietly. "How much we've changed." Clara looked at him, her eyes searching his face for any sign of what he was thinking. But before she could say anything, he pulled her into a gentle hug, and for a moment, they just stood there, in the middle of the bustling city, wrapped in each other's arms. It was a moment of quiet comfort, something neither of them had expected to find in the chaos of their lives. As they pulled away from the embrace, Clara felt a sense of clarity. She had no idea what the future held for them, but for the first time, she felt a spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this marriage, this contract they had entered into, could turn into something real, something worth fighting for. As the weeks passed, Vincent and Clara's routine continued to evolve, but the tension between them was beginning to shift. What started as a contractual arrangement, an agreement made out of necessity, began to feel more like a real partnership. They had spent countless nights in each other's company, sharing stories, eating dinner together, and even laughing at each other's awkward jokes. But despite all the moments they shared, neither of them was brave enough to confront the emotions that were slowly creeping in. Vincent was still the businessman he had always been, focused, calculated, and often distant. But there was something different about him now. He found himself thinking of Clara when he wasn't with her, wondering what she was doing, how she was feeling. She had, without meaning to, crept into his life in a way he hadn't anticipated. And Clara, for her part, found herself falling for him, just a little more each day. She had told herself at the beginning that this was just a marriage of convenience, that nothing would come of it beyond the business deal. But Vincent's kindness, his quiet attentiveness, had started to chip away at her walls. She had begun to see him not just as the cold CEO, but as a man with vulnerabilities and dreams. One evening, as they sat in their penthouse after another gala, Clara found herself gazing out the window, the city lights sparkling below them. Vincent was standing across the room, looking out at the skyline, his back turned to her. She couldn't help but watch him, her heart heavy with emotions she wasn't ready to confront. As if sensing her gaze, he turned to her. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, his voice calm, but with an underlying curiosity. Clara hesitated for a moment before answering. "I was just thinking about how much everything has changed." Vincent raised an eyebrow, intrigued by her response. "Changed how?" he asked, walking over to where she sat. "Well, when we first got married, I thought it would just be a business arrangement," she said softly. "But now I'm not so sure. It feels like we're building something more than just a contract." Vincent stood silently for a moment, taking in her words. For the first time, he allowed himself to truly think about what their relationship had become. It wasn't just business anymore, not really. There were real feelings here, unspoken, maybe, but real nonetheless. "Clara, I never intended for you to feel trapped in this marriage," Vincent said, his voice surprisingly soft. Clara looked up at him, her heart racing at the sincerity she saw in his eyes. "I know," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I can't help but wonder if this could be more than we thought." Vincent took a deep breath, stepping closer to her. He had been so afraid of getting too close, of letting his guard down. But now, in this quiet moment, he realized that he had already let her in. "I don't know what the future holds, but I do know one thing," he said, his voice steady. "I want to figure it out with you." Clara's breath caught in her throat. The words she had been longing to hear, words she had never expected to hear from him, were finally being spoken. She stood up, her heart pounding. "Vincent, But before she could say anything else, he reached out, gently taking her hand in his. "You don't have to say anything," he said, his voice low but filled with conviction. "I just need you to know that I'm not going anywhere." Clara's mind raced. Was this really happening? Was Vincent finally admitting that he wanted more than just a business partnership, that he wanted to be with her? She looked up at him, her eyes filled with emotion, and nodded. For the first time since their wedding, Clara felt a weight lift off her shoulders. Maybe this marriage, which had begun as a mere transaction, was becoming something far more meaningful. But before she could respond, the doorbell rang, interrupting the moment. Clara's heart skipped a beat as she glanced at Vincent. "Who could that be?" she asked, her voice tinged with uncertainty. Vincent's expression darkened, a flash of concern crossing his face. "I don't know, but I have a feeling it's something we're not prepared for," he said, his tone serious. As the doorbell rang again, louder this time, Vincent and Clara exchanged a look, both wondering what new challenge they were about to face in this unexpected journey they had started together. They both knew that their relationship had shifted, but neither of them could have predicted what would happen next. Whatever came next, they would face it together, as a team, or so they hoped. As the doorbell rang again, the tension in the air grew thick. Vincent exchanged a brief glance with Clara, both of them wondering who could be interrupting their quiet moment. Vincent hesitated for a moment, then walked toward the door, his hand resting on the handle. Clara, still standing by the window, could feel her heart race as the unknown presence on the other side seemed to promise something unexpected. Vincent opened the door, and standing there was a man, tall and imposing, dressed in a sharp suit. His expression was unreadable, and there was something about him that immediately put Vincent on guard. "Vincent Lee," the man said, his voice low and steady. "We need to talk." Clara, sensing the sudden shift in the atmosphere, moved toward the door, standing behind Vincent. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice wary but composed. The man didn't answer her directly. Instead, he looked at Vincent with an intensity that seemed to speak volumes. "I'm Nathan Park," he said. "You don't know me, but I know you." Vincent's eyes narrowed as he studied Nathan. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice cold. Nathan took a step forward, his eyes briefly flickering toward Clara before settling back on Vincent. "I came to warn you," he said. "You think this marriage is just a contract, just a deal, but it's more than that. You're playing a dangerous game, and you don't even realize it yet." The words hung in the air, heavy with implications, and Clara could feel the weight of them pressing down on her. What was this man talking about? What kind of danger were they really in? Vincent's face remained impassive, but Clara could tell that the mention of danger had hit a nerve. "You're not making sense," Vincent replied, his voice sharp. "We have nothing to discuss. This is between me and Clara." Nathan smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "You're wrong," he said. "This involves a lot more than just the two of you. Your marriage is just the beginning. It's part of a much larger picture, one that you haven't seen yet." Clara felt a chill run down her spine. The air between the three of them was thick with tension, and she could sense that whatever Nathan was implying was far from good. Vincent took a deep breath, his calm demeanor never wavering. "I don't know what game you're playing, but I'm not interested. Now leave," he said firmly, his voice commanding. But Nathan didn't move. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a manila envelope, handing it to Vincent. "This is just a small piece of the puzzle," Nathan said, his voice low. "You're going to want to look at this, Vincent. You're going to need it sooner than you think." Vincent stared at the envelope for a moment, uncertainty flickering in his eyes. Clara could see the doubt beginning to creep into his otherwise confident exterior, and it only made her more uneasy. Finally, Vincent took the envelope from Nathan, his fingers brushing against the cold paper. "Get out," he said, his tone final. Nathan said nothing more. He just nodded and turned, walking away without another word. Vincent closed the door behind him, the sound of the lock clicking shut echoing in the stillness of the room. The tension in the air had not lifted, and Clara's curiosity burned. "What was that all about?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Vincent didn't immediately answer. He stared at the envelope in his hand, clearly deep in thought. Clara could see the wheels turning in his mind, the gears of his business instincts clicking into place. After a moment, he walked over to the table, setting the envelope down. "I don't know," he said quietly, "but it's something I have to look into." Clara approached him, her heart racing. "Vincent, what did he mean about this marriage being dangerous?" she asked, her voice full of concern. Vincent turned to her, his face serious. "I don't know, Clara, but I'm going to find out. This isn't just about us anymore. There's something bigger at play here, something that could affect everything we've worked for." Clara's mind raced. She had never imagined that their marriage, which had started as a simple business arrangement, could become this complicated. She had thought that once they made their deal, everything would fall into place, that they could go on with their lives, each in their own world. But now, it seemed like they were on the brink of something much darker, something neither of them had anticipated. The days that followed were filled with uncertainty. Vincent spent more and more time on the phone, meeting with lawyers, trying to figure out what Nathan had meant. Clara, for her part, tried to stay out of his way, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The man who had once seemed so confident, so in control, was now consumed with worry and doubt. It was a side of Vincent that she hadn't seen before, and it only made her more anxious. One evening, after a long day of meetings, Vincent sat in the living room, his head in his hands, clearly exhausted. Clara couldn't stand seeing him like this. She sat down beside him, her heart heavy with emotion. "Vincent," she said softly, "we'll figure this out. We're in this together." Vincent looked at her, his eyes tired but grateful. "I don't know what's coming, Clara, but I promise I won't let it tear us apart." And in that moment, Clara realized that, despite everything that had happened, despite the business deals and the complications, she was beginning to believe him. She was beginning to believe that maybe, just maybe, their marriage had a chance, if they could survive whatever was coming their way. As the days dragged on, Vincent and Clara found themselves trapped in a web of uncertainty. The envelope Nathan had left on their doorstep remained untouched for days, and the mystery surrounding it only seemed to grow. Vincent's once confident demeanor had begun to crack, and Clara, though determined to stay by his side, couldn't help but feel the weight of the unknown pressing down on them. She had hoped that their marriage, however unconventional, would lead to a sense of stability, a partnership built on mutual understanding. But now, every time she looked at Vincent, she saw the same doubt and fear that had started to consume him. The longer they waited, the more the questions piled up. One evening, after another long day of phone calls and meetings, Vincent finally sat down at the table, the envelope in front of him. Clara had been waiting for him to take the first step, but she hadn't expected the moment to come like this. Vincent's hand trembled slightly as he reached for the envelope, the seal still unbroken. Clara watched as he slowly opened it, his eyes scanning the contents with a furrowed brow. As he read, his expression darkened, and Clara's heart skipped a beat. "What is it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Vincent didn't look up immediately. His mind was clearly racing as he processed the information in front of him. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he set the papers down and met Clara's gaze. "It's worse than I thought," he said, his voice strained. "Nathan, he was right. This marriage, this whole deal, it's part of something much bigger. There are people involved who don't want us together." Clara's breath caught in her throat. "What do you mean? Who are these people?" Vincent stood up abruptly, pacing the room. "I don't know yet, but the more I look into it, the more I realize that this isn't just about business. There are forces at play, forces that want to control both of us, and they'll stop at nothing to make sure we don't succeed." Clara felt a chill run down her spine. She had known their marriage was far from ordinary, but this was beyond anything she had imagined. She had thought the worst was over, that they had overcome the hardest part by simply agreeing to marry each other. But now, it seemed as though they were just getting started, and the dangers they faced were more real than ever. "What do we do?" Clara asked, her voice trembling slightly. "We fight," Vincent replied, his voice steady but with an edge of determination. "We fight for this, for us. But I need you to trust me. I need you to stand by me, because this is bigger than us. And I can't do this alone." Clara looked at him, seeing the man she had slowly come to care for, the man who was willing to fight for their future, even if it meant risking everything. She didn't fully understand the depth of the threat they were facing, but she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going to let him face it alone. "I trust you," she said softly, walking over to where he stood. "I'm with you, Vincent. Whatever it takes." Vincent's expression softened, and for a moment, the cold, calculating businessman disappeared. In his place was a man who, for the first time, allowed himself to feel something real. "Thank you," he said, his voice filled with gratitude. As they stood there, in the quiet of their penthouse, the weight of their situation still hanging over them, Clara felt a surge of determination. This wasn't just about a business deal anymore. It was about their lives, their future, and the possibility of something more. They were in this together. And no matter how deep the conspiracy ran, they would face it head on. The days that followed were a blur of meetings, research, and planning. Vincent and Clara dug deeper into the mystery, uncovering connections and threats that stretched far beyond their control. They learned that the people behind this plot were powerful, well-connected, and determined to make sure their marriage failed. But every new piece of information only made them more resolved to protect what they had built. As the tension mounted, Clara found herself spending more time with Vincent, not just as his wife, but as his partner. They were a team, and with every passing day, their bond grew stronger. The moments they shared, whether it was a quiet dinner or a late-night conversation about their next move, became the foundation for something real. One evening, after another long day of research, Vincent sat at the desk in their living room, his eyes scanning through pages of documents. Clara walked in, her steps quiet, and stood beside him. "You're pushing yourself too hard," she said, her hand resting on his shoulder. Vincent looked up at her, exhaustion in his eyes. "I can't afford to stop," he replied. "There's too much at stake." Clara smiled softly, her eyes filled with understanding. "I know," she said, "but you don't have to do it alone. We're in this together, remember?" Vincent's lips curled into a small smile, and for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to relax. "Together," he echoed, before pulling her into a hug. In that moment, Clara knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. They were no longer just two people bound by a contract. They were partners, in every sense of the word, and nothing could tear them apart. As the days passed, Vincent and Clara's resolve grew stronger, but so did the danger that loomed over them. They had uncovered more about the conspiracy threatening their marriage, and with every revelation, the stakes grew higher. Vincent had never been one to shy away from a challenge, but this was different. It wasn't just his company or his reputation at risk anymore. It was their lives. They were no longer just two people bound by a business arrangement. They were partners, fighting for something real, something that neither of them had expected to find. The tension was palpable. Every time Vincent left for a meeting or Clara spent hours on research, they both knew the other was only one step away from danger. But the more they worked together, the more their connection deepened. They began to rely on each other in ways they hadn't anticipated. One afternoon, Clara sat at the table, staring at the files spread out before her. Vincent was on the phone with a lawyer, his voice low and focused. Clara's thoughts drifted as she watched him, feeling a sense of admiration she hadn't allowed herself to feel before. She had always seen him as the businessman, the CEO with the cold, calculated mind. But now, she saw the man behind the persona, the man who cared, the man who was doing everything he could to protect their future. He finished his call and turned to her, his expression serious. "We're getting closer," he said, his voice tight. "But we still don't have all the pieces. Whoever is behind this doesn't want us to succeed, and they'll stop at nothing to tear us apart." Clara nodded, her heart heavy with the weight of their situation. "I know," she said softly. "But we're not going to let them win, right?" Vincent gave her a small, reassuring smile. "No, we're not." Over the next few days, they continued to dig deeper, uncovering connections between powerful people and shady business dealings that reached far beyond what they had imagined. Every piece of information they uncovered felt like a piece of a puzzle, but it was still incomplete. It was as if they were chasing something that was just out of reach. One night, after an exhausting day of meetings, Vincent stood by the window, looking out at the city. Clara joined him, standing beside him in silence. The lights of the city flickered below them, but in that moment, the world felt quiet. Vincent turned to her, his eyes searching hers. "Clara," he said, his voice softer than she had heard it in weeks. "I don't know what's going to happen. This situation, this fight, it's bigger than both of us. But I need you to know something." Clara's heart skipped a beat, the weight of his words sinking in. "What is it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I never expected this marriage to turn into something real," Vincent said, his voice barely audible. "But I care about you. More than I ever thought I could." Clara felt her breath catch in her throat. She had known it. Of course, she had felt it too. But hearing him say it out loud, it made everything feel more real, more complicated. "I care about you too," she said, her voice trembling slightly. Vincent stepped closer to her, his hand reaching for hers. "I know this hasn't been easy for either of us," he said, his touch warm against her skin. "But I'm not backing down. I'm going to fight for this. For us." Clara looked up at him, her eyes filled with emotion. In that moment, everything else, the danger, the conspiracy, the pressure, seemed to fade away. It was just the two of them, standing together in the quiet of their penthouse, bound not just by a marriage contract, but by something deeper, something stronger. Vincent leaned in slowly, his face inches from hers. For a moment, everything was still. And then, as if the world had shifted, he kissed her. It wasn't a kiss born out of obligation or business, but one that held all the unspoken feelings they had been too afraid to express. It was soft, tender, and full of promise. When they finally pulled away, Vincent looked at her, his eyes filled with determination. "We're in this together," he said, his voice firm. Clara smiled, her heart lighter than it had been in weeks. "Together," she echoed, knowing that no matter what came next, they would face it side by side. The next few weeks were filled with even more uncertainty, but Vincent and Clara continued to push forward. They knew they had no choice but to keep going, to keep fighting for their future. But as they worked together, their bond grew stronger, and the love that had slowly begun to take root in their hearts only deepened. They knew that the battle ahead would not be easy, but with each other, they felt ready to face whatever came their way. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, they both believed in the possibility of a new beginning. As Vincent and Clara continued to navigate the growing dangers surrounding them, they found themselves at a crossroads. The conspiracy that threatened their marriage was becoming more complex, and the pressure was mounting. The deeper they dug into the mystery, the more they realized how high the stakes were, not just for them, but for their families and businesses as well. Every day brought new revelations, new threats, and with each passing hour, the distance between them and the people pulling the strings seemed to grow. Vincent spent countless hours on the phone with lawyers, private investigators, and advisors, trying to uncover the truth behind the conspiracy. But no matter how much information they uncovered, they were always one step behind. The shadowy figures orchestrating the plot seemed to anticipate every move they made, and it felt like they were running out of time. Clara, too, was involved in the investigation, but her focus was more on keeping Vincent grounded. She could see how much the pressure was taking a toll on him, how the constant worry and the weight of their situation were pushing him to his limits. Yet, despite the chaos surrounding them, Clara felt a growing sense of hope. They had been through so much together already, and with each challenge they overcame, their bond grew stronger. The love that had begun as a fragile thread was now something far more powerful, and Clara found herself believing in the possibility of a future beyond the danger they faced. One evening, as Vincent returned from yet another grueling meeting, Clara noticed the exhaustion in his eyes. He was pushing himself harder than ever, and it was starting to show. He barely looked up as he walked into their penthouse, dropping his briefcase on the table. Clara, who had been waiting for him, stood up from the couch, her concern evident. "Vincent," she said softly, her voice filled with care. "You need to take a break. You can't keep going like this." Vincent ran a hand through his hair, frustration and fatigue mixing in his expression. "I don't have time for a break, Clara," he said, his tone sharper than usual. "We're running out of time, and I can't afford to slow down now." Clara stepped closer to him, her eyes softening as she reached out to touch his arm. "I know you feel the pressure, but you're not alone in this. We're in this together, remember?" Vincent looked at her, his gaze softening just a little. "I know," he murmured, his voice quieter now. "But it feels like no matter what I do, it's never enough." Clara took a deep breath, her heart aching. For him, she could see how much he was carrying, how much he was sacrificing to protect her, to protect their future. "Vincent, I believe in you," she said firmly, her voice full of conviction. "And I believe in us. We can get through this. Together." For a moment, there was silence between them. Then, Vincent reached for her hand, his grip firm and steady. "Together," he repeated, his voice filled with determination. It was a simple word, but it carried so much weight. It was a promise that no matter how dark things got, they would face it side by side. Over the next few days, Vincent and Clara began to make progress. They discovered that the conspiracy was tied to some of the most powerful figures in the city, people who had been manipulating events behind the scenes for years. But the more they uncovered, the more dangerous the situation became. They knew that time was running out, and the threat against them was growing by the day. Yet, through it all, their connection remained strong. Clara found herself more determined than ever to protect their love and their future. She couldn't help but wonder how far they would have to go to uncover the truth, and what price they might have to pay to ensure their safety. As they sat together one night, Vincent spoke the words Clara had been dreading to hear. "There's no turning back now," he said, his voice steady but filled with an undeniable weight. "We have to be ready for whatever comes next." Clara nodded, her heart heavy with the realization of just how much was at stake. But as she looked at Vincent, she knew one thing for sure. They would face whatever came next together. No matter how dangerous, no matter how difficult, they were stronger now, bound by something deeper than a business arrangement. It was love, and nothing could tear them apart. The days that followed were filled with intense moments of anticipation and fear. The investigation had reached a point where every choice felt like it could be their last. The conspiracy, which had once seemed like a distant threat, was now knocking at their door, and the realization hit them both with full force. Vincent and Clara knew that the only way to survive was to expose the truth before it was too late. With every passing day, the danger intensified. They had uncovered names, connections, and shady dealings, but still, there were more questions than answers. It was as though the deeper they dug, the more elusive the truth became. But they weren't backing down. They couldn't. What started as a marriage of convenience had turned into something much more. They had become partners in every sense of the word. Every day brought new challenges, but with each new hurdle, their bond grew stronger. Clara found herself more determined than ever to protect Vincent, not just for the sake of their marriage, but for the life they were beginning to build together. She had fallen for him in a way she hadn't thought possible. The cold, distant businessman she had once known was now someone she trusted with her heart. The love between them wasn't perfect, nothing was, but it was real, and that was all that mattered. One night, as they sat together in the quiet of their penthouse, Vincent's eyes were glued to the stack of papers in front of him. The stress of the situation was wearing on him. Clara could see it in his eyes. His jaw was tight, and his shoulders were stiff, as if the weight of everything had settled on him. Clara walked over to him and placed her hand on his shoulder, her touch gentle but firm. "Vincent, you need to rest," she said softly, her voice full of concern. "We can't keep going at this pace. It's not healthy." Vincent didn't look up immediately, but he could feel her presence, her warmth. "I can't stop now, Clara," he replied, his voice rough. "I'm so close to finding the last piece of the puzzle. We're almost there." Clara knelt beside him, her eyes searching his face for any sign of the man she had come to know, the man who had been her rock in all of this. "I know," she said softly, "but I don't want you to break. You've done more than enough. Let me help." Vincent finally looked up at her, his eyes filled with exhaustion but also gratitude. "I'm sorry, Clara," he said quietly. "I've been so focused on this that I haven't been paying attention to you, to us. I don't want to lose you." Clara smiled, her heart swelling with affection. "You won't lose me, Vincent. I'm not going anywhere. But you need to. Trust that we can handle this together. You don't have to carry this burden alone." Vincent reached out and took her hand, his grip strong but tender. "Together," he repeated, the word carrying more weight than either of them had realized. They both knew that the challenges they faced were far from over, but in that moment, standing together, it felt as if they could face anything. The next few days were filled with action. They began to make their move, carefully orchestrating their plan to expose those who had been pulling the strings behind the scenes. It was risky, dangerous even, but they had no other choice. They were determined to take down the people who had been trying to destroy them, who had tried to tear their lives apart. Vincent and Clara worked tirelessly, gathering evidence, making calls, and meeting with people who had once been their enemies. They had built a team, one that was loyal to them, to their cause. It was no longer just about saving themselves. It was about exposing the truth and bringing justice to those who thought they could control everything. One evening, as they prepared for a crucial meeting that could change everything, Vincent took Clara aside. "This is it," he said, his voice steady but filled with urgency. "Once we do this, there's no going back. But I know we're doing the right thing. We have to expose them all." Clara nodded, her expression serious. "I'm ready," she said, her voice full of determination. "We've come this far, and we're not stopping now." Vincent smiled, the weight of everything lifting just a little. "We're a team," he said, his voice low but full of conviction. "And together, we can do anything." The meeting they had been preparing for finally arrived. It was a delicate balance of strategy, risk, and nerves. The room was filled with people they once thought they could trust, people who had been working behind their backs for far too long. As the meeting unfolded, Vincent and Clara's plan began to take shape. They presented the evidence they had gathered, slowly and carefully revealing the truth. It was a tense moment, but as the pieces of the puzzle came together, they saw the shock on their adversaries' faces. For the first time, they were in control. The plan had worked. They had exposed the conspiracy, and in doing so, they had taken back their lives. But as the dust settled, Clara couldn't help but feel a sense of uncertainty. The battle was won, but what came next? Vincent noticed the look on her face and walked over to her. "We did it, Clara," he said, his voice soft. "We took them down. Together." Clara smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "Together," she repeated. And in that moment, they both realized that no matter what came next, they had each other, and that was all that mattered. The dust had finally settled. Vincent and Clara stood side by side, their hearts still racing from the intense battle they had just fought. The conspiracy that had threatened to tear their lives apart was exposed, and justice was beginning to take its course. As they walked out of the meeting room, the weight of what they had accomplished began to sink in. The people who had manipulated them were now facing the consequences of their actions, and for the first time in a long while, Vincent felt a sense of relief. But as they stepped out into the cool evening air, Clara couldn't shake the feeling of uncertainty. The fight had been long, but it wasn't over. While the immediate threat was behind them, there was still so much to rebuild. The last few months had changed everything for both of them. Their lives, their relationship, had been tested in ways they could never have imagined. Vincent, noticing her distant expression, turned to her, his eyes filled with concern. "Clara," he said softly, "are you okay?" Clara looked up at him, her heart swelling with emotion. She had been through so much, and so had he. But through it all, they had remained strong, and they had come out of the darkness together. "I'm fine," she replied, her voice steady but filled with emotion. I don't know what comes next. It feels like we've won the battle, but there's still so much to figure out. Vincent smiled, a rare, genuine smile that reached his eyes. We'll figure it out, Clara. We always do. Clara's heart fluttered at his words. She had never expected to find someone like Vincent in her life. When they had first married, it was for reasons that felt so distant, so businesslike. But now, standing here with him, she realized that it had never been just about the contract. It had always been about them, their connection, and the unexpected love that had bloomed between them. As they walked together, hand in hand, through the city streets, Clara felt a renewed sense of hope. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time, she wasn't afraid. With Vincent by her side, she knew they could face anything that came their way. We've come so far, she said, her voice full of gratitude. I don't know what I would have done without you. Vincent squeezed her hand, his voice low but filled with sincerity. And I don't know what I would have done without you, he replied. They stopped for a moment, standing in the quiet street, the noise of the city fading into the background. It was just the two of them, together. The love they shared was no longer just a flicker of hope. It was a burning flame, one that could withstand anything. Vincent looked at Clara, his eyes soft with affection. We've been through so much, and now it's time to start something new, he said. Clara nodded, a smile tugging at her lips. I'm ready, she said, her voice full of resolve. And with that, they turned to face the future, knowing that whatever it held, they would face it together. No more secrets, no more fears. Just them, as a team. As they walked into the night, the city lights illuminating their path, Clara felt a sense of peace she hadn't felt in months. They had fought hard for what they had, and now, they were free to build the life they wanted. Their journey was far from over, but Clara knew one thing for sure. They were in it together, and that was all they needed. The end of this chapter was just the beginning of a new one where love, trust, and partnership would guide them through whatever came next. Together, they had overcome the darkness, and now, they were ready to embrace the light.